The life of Moses is one of the most remarkable and powerful stories in the Bible, filled with miracles, divine encounters, and the unfolding of God's perfect plan for his people. Through Moses, God liberated the Israelites from centuries of slavery in Egypt, delivered his law, and established the foundations of a covenant relationship with his chosen people. As we explore Moses' life, we see the greatness and faithfulness of God, who uses Moses as his servant and instrument to fulfill his divine purposes. Moses' life glorifies God by demonstrating how the Almighty transforms an imperfect and reluctant man into one of the greatest leaders in history, and how God's promises always prevail. The birth and preservation of Moses. Moses was born into a dark time in the history of the Israelites. The people of Israel, descendants of Abraham, had been living in Egypt for generations, and they had grown numerous. Threatened by their population size, the Pharaoh of Egypt had enslaved the Israelites and subjected them to harsh labor. Worse yet, he decreed that all male Hebrew babies be killed at birth to prevent them from becoming too powerful. But God's hand was already at work. When Moses was born, his mother, Jochebed, refused to obey Pharaoh's command and hid him for 3 months. Knowing she could no longer keep him hidden, she placed him in a basket and set him afloat on the Nile River, trusting God with his life. This act of faith resulted in an incredible act of divine providence. Pharaoh's own daughter found the baby Moses, and despite the royal edict, she took him in and raised him as her own son. Even from his infancy, we see God's sovereign protection over Moses. Though born into a time of oppression and death, God had a purpose for Moses that no human power could thwart. Through a series of events orchestrated by God, Moses was not only saved from death but was raised in the royal palace, given the education and status of an Egyptian prince. This upbringing uniquely prepared him for the role he would later assume as the deliverer of God's people. Moses' early life, called but unready. As Moses grew up in the palace, he became acutely aware of his Hebrew heritage and the suffering of his people. Though living in comfort and privilege, he could not ignore the oppression of the Israelites. One day, when he saw an Egyptian taskmaster brutally beating a Hebrew slave, Moses intervened and killed the Egyptian. Fearing the consequences, Moses fled Egypt and settled in the land of Midian, where he became a shepherd and married Zipporah, the daughter of a Midianite priest. During this period of Moses' life, it might have seemed like God had forgotten his people. Moses was far from Egypt, tending sheep in the wilderness, and the Israelites remained in bondage. However, God's timing is always perfect. While Moses was in Midian, God was preparing him for the great mission that lay ahead. It is a reminder that even in seasons of waiting or exile, God is at work, molding us for his purposes. The burning bush. Moses' divine calling. After 40 years in Midian, when Moses was about 80 years old, God dramatically called him into service. While tending his father-in-law's flock near Mount Horeb, Moses encountered a bush that was burning but not consumed by their fire. Out of the flames, God spoke to Moses, calling him by name and commissioning him to return to Egypt to lead the Israelites out of slavery. In this powerful encounter, God revealed his divine name, Yahweh, I am who I am, and made it clear that he had heard the cries of his people. God's plan was to use Moses as his chosen instrument to deliver Israel from the hand of Pharaoh and to bring them to a land flowing with milk and honey. Moses, however, was initially reluctant. He questioned his own ability, saying, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" Exodus 3:11. But God reassured him, "I will be with you." Exodus 3:12. Moses then expressed doubt about how the people would believe that God had sent him, so God gave him miraculous signs, including the ability to turn his staff into a serpent and to cause his hand to become leprous, and then healed again. Even with these signs, Moses continued to protest, claiming that he was slow of speech and tongue. Exodus 4:10. In response, God graciously appointed Moses' brother Aaron to be his spokesperson. Through Moses' doubts and fears, we see the patience and power of God. God doesn't choose leaders based on their qualifications, eloquence, or confidence. Instead, he equips and empowers those he calls. God's choice of Moses, despite his weaknesses, glorifies him by showing that it is God's strength and presence that accomplish great things, not human ability. Moses confronts Pharaoh, the power of God displayed. With God's call on his life, Moses returned to Egypt with Aaron by his side. There he confronted Pharaoh with the famous words, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go, that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness. Exodus 5:1. Pharaoh, however, hardened his heart and refused, even increasing the oppression on the Israelites. But Pharaoh's resistance was no match for God's power. In response to Pharaoh's stubbornness, God sent a series of 10 devastating plagues upon Egypt. Each plague demonstrated God's supremacy over the Egyptian gods and over nature itself. The Nile River turned to blood. Swarms of frogs and gnats filled the land. Livestock died. Boils afflicted the people, and a terrible hailstorm destroyed crops and animals. Locusts came and devoured what remained. Darkness covered the land for 3 days, and finally the most severe plague, the death of the firstborn, struck every Egyptian household. Through these plagues, God's power was on full display. Each plague was a direct challenge to the false gods of Egypt, revealing that Yahweh alone is the true and sovereign God. The deliverance of the Israelites was not merely a political or social act. It was a spiritual victory that glorified God as the supreme ruler over all creation. The Passover and the Exodus, God's deliverance. The final plague, the death of the firstborn, was the one that broke Pharaoh's resistance. Before this plague, God instructed Moses to have the Israelites sacrifice a lamb and spread its blood on the doorposts of their homes. This act of faith would protect them from the coming judgment, as the angel of death would pass over their homes, sparing their firstborn children. This event, known as the Passover, became one of the most significant celebrations in Jewish history, symbolizing God's salvation and his covenant with his people. Pharaoh finally relented, and Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt. This moment, the Exodus, was the fulfillment of God's promise to deliver his people. It was not only a physical liberation from slavery, but also a spiritual deliverance that pointed to God's redemptive power. God's hand was with Moses as he led the Israelites out of Egypt, guiding them with a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. Every step of the way, God's presence was with them, glorifying himself through his miraculous acts. The crossing of the Red Sea, God's mighty hand. The story of Moses reaches one of its most dramatic moments at the Red Sea. After the Israelites had left Egypt, Pharaoh once again hardened his heart and pursued them with his army. Trapped between the sea and Pharaoh's chariots, the Israelites were terrified. But Moses, trusting in God's power, declared, "Do not be afraid, stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today." Exodus 14:13. God then performed one of the greatest miracles in the Bible. He parted the Red Sea, allowing the Israelites to walk through on dry ground. As Pharaoh's army pursued them, God brought the waters back together, drowning the Egyptians and delivering his people once and for all. This miraculous event not only demonstrated God's supreme power over nature, but also symbolized his victory over oppression and evil. It was a defining moment in Israel's history and a powerful act of God's glory. The wilderness, testing, and provision. After the Israelites crossed the Red Sea, they began their journey through the wilderness toward the Promised Land. This period of wandering was marked by both testing and provision. The Israelites frequently grumbled and doubted God's ability to provide for them, despite the miracles they had witnessed. They complained about the lack of water and food, yet God graciously provided for their needs. He gave them manna from heaven, water from a rock, and quail to eat. God's provision in the wilderness reveals his faithfulness and mercy. Despite the people's lack of faith, God continued to care for them, demonstrating that he is a God who provides. Moses, as their leader, interceded for the people time and again, pointing to the role of a mediator who pleads on behalf of those who fall short. In this way, Moses' life glorifies God by revealing God's patience and unending grace. The giving of the law, a covenant with God's people. One of the most significant events in Moses' life occurred at Mount Sinai, where God gave him the 10 Commandments and the law for the people of Israel. This moment was not just about establishing rules. It was about God forming a covenant with his chosen people. The law revealed God's holiness, his desire for righteousness, and his love for his people. It was a blueprint for how Israel was to live as a nation set apart for God's purposes. At Mount Sinai, the glory of God was revealed in a dramatic and awe-inspiring way. The mountain was covered in smoke, thunder, and lightning as God descended upon it, and the voice of God was heard by the people. This event demonstrated the holiness and majesty of God, showing that he is not only a deliverer, but also a God of justice, holiness, and order. The giving of the law was a pivotal moment, as it established Israel's identity as God's covenant people, called to live in obedience to his commands. Moses acted as the mediator between God and the people, ascending the mountain to receive the Ten Commandments and deliver them to Israel. Through Moses, God communicated his moral will for his people, laying the foundation for a relationship based on his laws and statutes. This covenant relationship was built on the promises that God had made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and now, through Moses, it was formalized and made clear to the people of Israel. However, while Moses was on the mountain, the people of Israel quickly turned away from God. In his absence, they built a golden calf to worship, breaking the very first commandments that God had given them. When Moses descended from the mountain and saw the people worshiping the idol, he was filled with righteous anger, breaking the stone tablets as a sign of the covenant being broken. Even in the face of such rebellion, God's mercy and grace were evident. Moses interceded for the people, pleading with God to forgive them and to continue with them on their journey to the Promised Land. In response, God renewed his covenant with Israel, and Moses ascended the mountain again to receive a new set of tablets. This act of intercession highlights Moses' role as a foreshadowing of Christ, who would later come as the ultimate mediator between God and humanity, bringing a new and everlasting covenant. The tabernacle, God's presence with his people. Another significant aspect of Moses' leadership was the construction of the tabernacle, the portable sanctuary where God's presence would dwell among his people. God gave Moses detailed instructions for the building of the tabernacle, including the Ark of the Covenant, which represented God's throne on earth. The tabernacle was a tangible sign that God was dwelling in the midst of his people, guiding them and being with them on their journey. The presence of God in the tabernacle glorified him by showing his desire to be close to his people, despite their sin and rebellion. Though they were an imperfect people, God in his grace provided a way for them to approach him through the sacrificial system and the priesthood, both of which pointed forward to the ultimate sacrifice of Jesus Christ. Moses, as the leader who oversaw the construction of the tabernacle and instituted the worship of God, demonstrated that God desires a relationship with his people and that his presence is the key to their success and survival. Moses' leadership and the challenges in the wilderness. Throughout the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, Moses faced many challenges as the leader of Israel. The people constantly grumbled and complained, often expressing a desire to return to Egypt rather than trust in God's provision. They struggled with faith, and Moses was often left to bear the weight of their discontent. Despite the challenges, Moses remained faithful to God, acting as a shepherd to a stubborn and rebellious nation. One of the most notable challenges Moses faced occurred when the people once again complained about the lack of water. In frustration, Moses struck a rock to bring forth water, even though God had instructed him to speak to the rock. This disobedience, though seemingly small, had significant consequences. Because Moses had not followed God's precise command, he was told that he would not enter the Promised Land himself. This moment serves as a reminder that even great leaders are not above the need for obedience to God's word. Yet, even in this moment of discipline, God's grace shines through. Though Moses would not enter the Promised Land, God allowed him to see it from a distance and promised that his people would still receive the inheritance he had promised. Moses' faithfulness to God in leading the people, even when he knew he would not enter the Promised Land, glorifies God by demonstrating that it is God's purposes and promises that matter most, not individual glory or achievement. Moses' farewell and God's faithfulness. As the time for Israel to enter the Promised Land approached, Moses prepared the people for the transition. Knowing that his time as leader was coming to an end, Moses delivered a series of farewell speeches, which are recorded in the book of Deuteronomy. In these speeches, Moses reminded the people of God's faithfulness throughout their journey, warned them against idolatry, and encouraged them to remain obedient to God's laws. He also appointed Joshua as his successor, ensuring that the people would have a strong and faithful leader to guide them into the land. One of the most poignant moments in Moses' life came when God took him to the top of Mount Nebo, where he was allowed to see the Promised Land from afar. Though Moses would not enter it, God honored him by allowing him to see the fulfillment of the promise that had been made so many generations earlier to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. After this, Moses died on Mount Nebo, and the Bible records that God himself buried Moses in an undisclosed location, Deuteronomy 34:5-6. Moses' death marks the end of an era, but his legacy and the work that God accomplished through him lived on. The Bible speaks of Moses as the greatest prophet in Israel, saying, "Since then, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face." Deuteronomy 34:10. Moses' life glorifies God by pointing to his faithfulness, his justice, and his unwavering commitment to fulfill his promises. Through Moses, God not only delivered Israel from slavery, but also established a covenant and laid the foundation for his redemptive plan, which would be fully realized in Jesus Christ, glorifying God through Moses' life. The life of Moses glorifies God in countless ways. From the very beginning, we see God's providence and protection over Moses' life, ensuring that he would be preserved to fulfill the role of deliverer for Israel. In Moses' call at the burning bush, we see the glory of God's presence and his faithfulness to hear the cries of his people. Throughout the plagues, the Exodus, and the crossing of the Red Sea, God's mighty power is displayed, revealing that he alone is sovereign over nature, nations, and kings. Moses' life also glorifies God by demonstrating his holiness and the importance of obedience to his word. The giving of the law on Mount Sinai and the construction of the tabernacle showed that God desires a holy people who live in relationship with him. Moses' role as mediator between God and the people foreshadows the ultimate mediator, Jesus Christ, who would bring about the new covenant through his death and resurrection. Even in Moses' struggles and moments of weakness, we see God's grace and patience. Moses' leadership, though marked by human flaws, points to the sufficiency of God's strength and guidance. It is God who equips, empowers, and sustains his servants, ensuring that his purposes are fulfilled, despite human frailty. Conclusion. Moses and the glory of God. Moses' life is a powerful testimony to the greatness and glory of God. Through Moses, God delivered his people from bondage, gave them his law, and led them through the wilderness to the edge of the promised land. Moses' faithfulness to God despite challenges and personal setbacks glorifies God by demonstrating that his purposes always prevail, and his promises are always fulfilled. The story of Moses points us to the ultimate deliverance that would come through Jesus Christ, the greater Moses, who would lead his people out of the slavery of sin and into the freedom of eternal life. Just as Moses interceded for Israel and led them to the promised land, Jesus intercedes for us and brings us into the ultimate fulfillment of God's promises. In every part of Moses' life, we see the hand of God at work, glorifying himself and revealing his redemptive plan for his people. Moses' life encourages us to trust in God's faithfulness, to obey his commands, and to glorify him in all that we do.